Overlord. Volume 14, Chapter 3, The Last King, Part 3. At a distance away from the capital that would take the average traveler 3 days to cross, the Sorcerer's Kingdom's army could already be sighted. This report landed in Zanak's hands. To receive the Sorcerer's Kingdom's army's attack, the entire army of the kingdom had mobilized under Zanak's command. On the plains about half a day's worth of marching away from the capital, the kingdom's army had already established a front upon receiving news that the Sorcerer's Kingdom was invading from the west. According to their battle plans, they were to wait for the Sorcerer's Kingdom's army there. The front was built upon a wide bit of road that was locked down for this purpose. If the Sorcerer's Kingdom's army was to continue on their current, straight trajectory, this would be the most effective. However, if the Sorcerer's Kingdom was to change their direction of approach, there would be a need to form a new front. Though they were worried about that possibility, the reports all indicated that the Sorcerer's Kingdom was beelining for them. It appeared as though they did not have to worry about that possibility coming true. Yet no one was rejoicing because of it. The kingdom's army that will be facing against the Sorcerer's Kingdom's army this time around was comprised of levies from the neighboring nobles, the capital's militia, and able-bodied men drafted from the refugees. It would not be incorrect to call this army the kingdom's last hope. In total, there were over 400,000 men. To have formed such a large army was something worthy of praise, yet the reality was that they were scraping at the bottom of the barrel. Not many had suitable equipment, a lot of people only had a club. Even under this situation, morale was high. However, the reason for that was purely because they had the spirit of a cornered beast. They knew the extent of the cruelty the Sorcerer's Kingdom had displayed and thus took up arms through the sheer force of will to protect that which they hold dear. If their courage was to take a hit in any shape or form, the kingdom's army would surely instantaneously collapse. The size of the army was a weapon in and of itself. The long lines of soldiers alone gave off an overwhelming pressure without them doing anything at all. So then, for what purpose was the Sorcerer's Kingdom's army advancing straight towards this army of 400,000? Even those who aren't too well versed in battle tactics would know that facing such a large army head-on wasn't the best strategy. For the Sorcerer's Kingdom, their best strategy would have been to do nothing. They had an army full of the undead, which did not require supplies at all. In comparison, the kingdom's 400,000 strong force was akin to a gigantic yet starving beast. As long as they managed to completely surround them and apply pressure inwards, this giant beast would soon doom itself by starving to its death. Yet the Sorcerer's Kingdom's army marched in a straight line, destroying everything in their path. He knew of the Sorcerer King's firm grasp of the bigger picture, so it was hard to imagine that they had done so with no purpose in mind at all. The Sorcerer's Kingdom simply had confidence in their imminent victory. To something like the Sorcerer's Kingdom, this was not reckless behavior at all. To those who could defeat an army of 200,000 men with a single spell, this army of theirs could be wiped out with the use of only 2 spells. Of course, Zanak, as the general, did not want to believe that that could happen. However, the people, especially nobles, who believed in that notion weren't exactly a minority either. He understood why they had suggested that their forces should be split into groups. Though they could fall one by one, they also avoided the possibility of their entire army succumbing to a single spell. But they could not do that. Due to the devastating loss they had experienced during the Battle of the Katsa Plains as well as the current invasion by the Sorcerer's Kingdom, not many noblemen who had the skills to command such a large number of soldiers and cavalry were left. Splitting their forces would not create smaller armies. This force of 400,000 soldiers would suddenly turn into 400,000 commoners instead. It was precisely because they had this many men gathered, this many comrades in one place, that people had the courage to face the Sorcerer's Kingdom. They had been manning this front for 2 days now. A lot of time had been eaten up by the preparation this many men required. After both sides had set up their formations, the Sorcerer's Kingdom's army had adopted a prideful attitude that said loud and clear, We gave you just enough time to prepare. Their forces numbered around 10,000, comprising 3 to 4 types of undead. This was a minuscule number in the face of 400,000 men. However, in terms of individual strength, the Sorcerer's Kingdom's army undoubtedly held an overwhelming advantage against them. Your Highness. I know. Zanak gave a prompt reply to the Minister of Military Affairs. The minister's movements were stiff, almost comical at times, due to his unfamiliarity with the armor he wore. But, Zanak was not a pot to call the kettle black. He was wearing what used to be Gazef's armor, one of the treasures of the kingdom. Zanak knew that it did not suit him at all, he was far from Gazef's league. But, Zanak was thankful for this magically enchanted armor. These past few days, Zanak had been packing on the pounds due to his stress-eating habits. If it wasn't for the armor's enchanted nature, he would have had to request a blacksmith to add an inch to the waist area. Bring forth my horse. A steed was brought forth to Zanak's large tent by a knight following his order. It took Zanak quite a bit of effort to get on his favorite horse, which did not look too kindly to Zanak. He did not take any bodyguards along with him as he rode out of the front and towards the Sorcerer's Kingdom's army. Even if he brought bodyguards along, if the Sorcerer King wanted to kill him, bodyguards would be completely useless. They could not serve as deterrents at all. That was why riding solo was effectively a demonstration to the onlookers of his courage. If he was killed while riding solo, it would serve to damage the Sorcerer King's public image. The hero of Riestais has a nice ring to it. Zanak reached the midpoint between the two armies with no obstacles at all. He activated a magic item to amplify his voice. I am the Prince of the Kingdom of Riestais, Zanak Valianaganaril Vyself. I wish to seek an audience with His Majesty the Sorcerer King. Zanak did not plan to fight a battle of wits against the Sorcerer King. Things had already come to a point where that was completely meaningless. He just wanted to find out what kind of a thought process would have led the Sorcerer King to do what he had done. In surveyed the front, his army had formed from a three-sided tarpaulin tent. Due to the fact that the Sorcerer's Kingdom's army was comprised of undead beings that did not require food resupplies, the front they had formed was much smaller than what a conventional army would have. From an objective perspective, there was no need to establish a front at all, and some had even suggested this to him. However, Inns believed that front building was a valuable experience to gain too. Actually, from the several fronts they had formed already, the one in front of him looked to be a lot sturdier than what they had at the start. At first, these fronts were formed with the aid of Mare's magic, but due to a specific reason, Mare had been relegated to simply watching the soldiers build the front at Inns' side. Aura was also watching the soldiers on the side, but it appeared that she was only observing her own servants. No matter if it was front building or tents, magic could always produce an outcome of higher quality. However, due to the same reason as above, Inns had ordered this tent that was currently being used as their mobile headquarters to be transported to this location through physical means. It might be a good idea to leave all civil engineering tasks in the future to Mare. Amongst the populace of the Sorcerer's Kingdom, there were many races of demi-humans and heteromorphs that were adept at digging tunnels. It would be a good idea to make them subordinate to Mare. That said, Albedo or someone else might have also had this idea and put it into action already. If someone had done so already, then the relevant documentation for this should have already been perused by Inns. There was a need for him to ask Albedo about this in a roundabout way later. Was she being tacit? Albedo, who should have been working hard to establish the front, had returned with Cositus. In Sama. It appears as though the humans have sent an envoy. How shall we proceed? Not a messenger to declare the start of the battle? Prepare a reception. Prepare the receptive drinks as well. As Albedo began to prepare the table, chairs, and such, a man wearing full plate armor on horseback entered Inns' line of sight. Inns recognized the armor worn by that man. I think that's Gazef Stranov's armor. Is this man the vice warrior captain? He's quite different from the descriptions I've heard. The envoy stopped between the two armies and started yelling his introduction. I am the prince of the kingdom of Riestais, Ch3 P3 myself. I wish to seek an audience with His Majesty the Sorcerer King. He could hear him clearly even from this distance. He must have used some kind of magic item. What should we do, Insama? If he is not here to declare the start of the battle, then it would be a waste of time to converse with him. Shall we initiate the battle as is? No, Albedo, we cannot do that. The opponent desires to have a battle of wits with ins. Sama, if we rejected him outright, it would reflect negatively on the people's impression of ins. Sama's magnanimity. What value do rumors hold? Albedo sneered, they are dead men walking, what good are rumors that fall on no ears? Ins was not too keen on fighting a battle of wits or whatever, surely the royalty of this country would not lose out to him in anything other than combat prowess. Still. Albedo. Have you forgotten about the possibility that the rumor could be transmitted through magic? I'm terribly sorry. I will go then. The royalty of our opposition came alone. If I were not to do the same, it would not reflect well on us. Are you sure it will be all right? Insama. I have no idea. Aura, if I were to be brainwashed or mind-controlled, you should use your world-class item to protect me. Ins's usual world-class item was in Nazarik's storage, so if Aura used depiction of nature and society on him, he would be trapped in it. This way, even if he was brainwashed, they could not kidnap him through teleportation or other similar methods. Understood. Ins replied to Aura and left the front on a Soul Eater. It was worth noting that after Ins had practiced horse riding, he looked adequate while doing it. However, because he wasn't too apt at it, to prevent making a blunder in front of the two armies, Ins still chose to ride a Soul Eater to be on the safe side. The other party was waiting for Ins next to his horse, so Ins also got off the Soul Eater upon arriving at his destination. No matter how bad this was going to get for him, Ins steeled himself to do to others what they had done to him. His opponent was a man on the chubbier side of the spectrum. Makeup caked his face to cover up the dark circles under his eyes. Nice to meet you, Your Majesty the Sorcerer King. My name is Ch3 P3 myself. Nice to meet you, I am the Sorcerer King Ins Oulgown. I will be in your care then. Now, a standing conversation would be neither here nor there. Ins cast a spell twice, producing two black thrones that faced each other. Because it was created with magic, the two thrones were naturally identical. Though it is hard and metallic, we should still sit down first. How do you feel about that? I would be glad to, Your Majesty. As they both sat down on the thrones, Ins cast another spell to create a reflective black table between them. While Ins had started casting magic the moment they had met, Ch3 did not seem to be on guard at all. It appeared as though he did not have any intention to assassinate Ins. Afterwards, Ins took out 2 cups and an ice-filled container from his inventory. How about some water? Alcohol would be inappropriate given our current situation, so, what about orange juice instead? Thank you very much, Your Majesty. Just water would be fine. Now then, we are all set for the talk. What should we discuss then? Perhaps about the justification of our invasion. That would not be necessary, Your Majesty. I am more interested in the reason why you were insistent on carrying out such heinous acts. Why did you refuse our offer to surrender? That was a natural question for him to ask. Although to Ins, his reasons were clear and justified, to them it must have appeared to be senseless slaughter. Ins nodded his head. Given how things had turned out, there was no point in hiding his intentions anymore. He began to exposit the Sorcerer's Kingdom's plans to Zanak. Because we stood to gain nothing from that. I intend to sacrifice your people as an example to the world of what would happen to them if they stood against the Sorcerer's Kingdom. To that end, you will all be eradicated and the kingdom will be rendered into a mountain of ash. That mountain will continue to serve as a warning after centuries, after millennia, of how foolish of an act it would be to go against the Sorcerer's Kingdom. You do not appear to be jesting. Of course not, I am just stating what is to come. Why? What do you mean? Ins could not read between Zanak's lines and thus replied with a question. Your Majesty, the Sorcerer King is in possession of immense amounts of power. Even if you did not do what you said you would, the people of the world would still come to know your awesome power. Zanak wetted his lips, swallowed a mouthful of saliva, and asked, why are you this petty? Petty, am I? Zanak tensed up at the possibility that he had angered Ins, but Ins was not angry at all. What is your goal? Ins grumbled to himself, what is your goal? In the past, to Ins no, to Satoru, to have met the buddies he had in the game of Yggdrasil was the epitome of his entire life. It was such a wonderful memory that all he wished for was to be reunited with his friends again. When the plug was about to be pulled from the game, when all of this was meant to be for naught, he was transported to this world instead. The end turned out not to be the end at all. But instead, it was a new beginning. The NPCs created by his friends began to exhibit free will. From their every move he could feel the remnants of his former companions. No, to be honest, the shock he had experienced at the beginning confused him so much that he was constantly worried about their betrayal. Looking back, that was moronic of him. Nowadays, he just did not question their loyalty at all. Yet, it did not seem like Ins was the only one who was transported to this world. He could see the footprints left behind by other players. Perhaps it was only natural then for him to think that his companions, the people who shared those good times with him, could have come to this world as well. It was only natural for him to wish for this. Of course, Ins knew that he was transported here during the final moments of the game's operation, which made his friend's appearance in this world unlikely. Actually, through the use of multiple spells and intel sources, he could faintly feel the lack of their presence. However, since he did not have concrete proof of that belief, the possibility of it happening still remained. One might call him an idiot for holding on to such vain hopes, one might also call him a futile loser too. But to the Ins of yesteryear, that was all his life had amounted to. And now that dream was gradually fading away. Sure, his friends were important to him, but now, the NPCs were important to him too. They were essentially children that had been left behind by his companions. Ins, as the only one to have stayed behind, had the duty to protect them at all costs. Because of this, Ins was willing to sacrifice his all to ensure no harm ever came to the NPCs. In order to ensure that Nazarick would never fall to outside forces, he had to prioritize the empowerment of the organization's every aspect. Shaltir was dominated by some unknown entity in the past. Though he had succeeded in regaining control over her, if things had turned out any worse back then, important intel on Nazarick could have been made known to outsiders, consequently, it could have led to the destruction of the guild. He could not allow something like that to ever happen again. What is my goal, you ask? I seek something that is difficult yet also easy to obtain. All I wish for, is a single thing. That is, happiness. Happiness. Zanak repeatedly blinked in surprise. Ins laughed a little in response. He did not find what he had said to be so outrageous. No matter if you're human or whatever, the pursuit of happiness is the ultimate goal, is it not? Ins threw away his act and began to converse with Zanak as if he was a close friend of his. And you would step over others' happiness to achieve your own. Isn't that obvious? If the happiness of those I hold dear could be guaranteed, those of others do not matter to me at all. If you could secure the happiness of your subjects by inflicting suffering on the citizenry of another country, what would you do? Would you say, abandon their happiness altogether? Those are the extremes. Zanak calmed down as the sentence trailed. He lowered his head and said, that was out of line of me. My apologies, Your Majesty. Inz went back to his ruler persona. It is fine, there is no need to worry at all. Even with the intellect and power of Your Majesty the Sorcerer King, there are no other possible methods to guarantee happiness. Perhaps, but, I could only say perhaps. If you had a guaranteed method to obtain happiness, what would be the better option? To seek a perhaps non-existent secondary method or sticking with what has been tried and true? The goddess of luck is bald at the back of her head after all, was that how the saying went? TL's note, Roman proverb, see Distica Catanus 2, 26. The English equivalent is take time by the forelock, but that cuts out the goddess part. Zanak was absolutely incredulous. What a strange goddess. Sorry, I did not mean to belittle the goddess you believe in. Please do forgive me. Haha, I don't mind at all. That wasn't something I believed in, just a proverb I remembered. Very well then, that is the extent of it all. For the happiness of my subjects, I must sacrifice your people. This is the basis for this war, do you get it? I guess so. I do relate to Your Majesty's desire. The pursuit of the betterment of one's own country and a guarantee to one's own countrymen's happiness, that could be said to be the only responsibility of a ruler. If the destruction of our people guaranteed the people of the Sorcerer's kingdom their happiness, I do understand why you did not accept our surrender. I suppose it couldn't be helped. Right? You get it? Now then, it's my turn for a question, but I don't really have one. Inz looked around while he pondered. Ah, right. The armor you're wearing reminded me of it, so I'll ask about that sword. The sword that Gazef Stranov wielded, who's currently in possession of it? It is currently under the safekeeping of a man named Brain Unglaus. Brain Unglaus? That man. When he dueled Gazef, there was someone by that name between the two men who had witnessed said duel. However, given how long ago that was, he could barely remember his appearance. Although he planned to turn the capital into ashes, he still planned to recover a few items, one of which being Gazef's sword. That man, has he come here too? No, he has not, Your Majesty. He should still be in the capital. Is that so? Then you wouldn't have any issue with what kind of magic I used to destroy you all, right? The one in charge of sieging the capital was Kosida, so he would have to order him to watch out for the sword later. While I have no intention to forfeit in this battle, I would be eternally grateful if Your Majesty was to use magic that would inflict the least amount of suffering on my people. You do have a point. I understand. After all, pleasant conversations like this one are hard to come by. For you especially, I shall try my best to kill you as gently as I could. Thank you very much. Zanak had on him a brilliant smile to which Inz could not help but feel amazed. This man's courage was quite sizable. If Inz was in his shoes, would he have been able to do the same? I don't think so. As expected of someone of royal blood. This has been very educational. Zanak took the glass cup in front of him and downed the water in a single gulp, as if he was not worried about poisons at all. Delicious, Your Majesty. Say, I do hope you could answer one last question of mine. Was Your Majesty the one who killed my brother, or was it one of Your Majesty's subordinates? Your brother. Inz tilted his head and after a short while, remembered the prince of the kingdom they had already disposed of. He could not recall his name, but did remember that it was super long. It was probably one of my subordinates. Is that true? So he was dead after all. I feel like a huge weight has been lifted from my shoulders. Your Majesty, thank you for telling me. I suppose it is time for us to bid farewell. After saying that, Zanak began walking towards his horse. Ins walked towards the Soul Eater after he had tidied up everything, only to find that Zanak was still waiting by his horse. Ins questioned in his mind why he had not already gotten onto his horse as he climbed onto the Soul Eater. Only after he had done so, did Zanak mount his horse. Between a prince and a king, it was easy to tell who held the higher status, so he had probably done so to avoid looking down on Ins from his high horse. To Ins, someone who had not studied equestrian etiquette, this was the proper protocol that the aristocracy should strive to follow. Zanak's standing in his mind rose by a bit. Looks like studying the etiquette of the upper class has become mandatory. What isn't at this point? Will the amount of things I have to learn ever decrease? Your Highness. The noblemen all came out to welcome Zanak back. Almost every noble that had answered his call was there. No one halted his exit from the front, yet now it felt like he could not get back in if he tried. That meant that everybody was anticipating for good news, the best of which would be if the Sorcerer King had agreed to Handak. Zanak answered their question with a curt reply. I couldn't do it. His Majesty the Sorcerer King plans to kill us all. That was non-negotiable to him. What he found to be surprising was the fact that there were still nobles who turned pale at this news. Were they still hoping that everything would turn out fine even with the current situation? Zanak got off his horse and left those nobles, who were all biting down on their lower lip and were deep in contemplation, behind to walk towards his own tent. After he entered the tent, the Minister of Military Affairs welcomed him, only for a sarcastic smile to surface on his face. That does not look like good news. In other words, just as we had expected, but, well, one thing did surprise a bit. Really? Speaking of which, I have never met with the Sorcerer King. Just what kind of an evil monster was he? Zanak smiled. He was more human than I thought. The Minister of Military Affairs was shocked at this answer. His eyes were so wide that they almost formed into circles. Perhaps that was the first time Zanak had seen him make that expression. Zanak began recalling his time with the Sorcerer King. It was true that on the outside, he appeared to be a terrifying monster, one that exuded an oppressive aura. Zanak could not even fathom how high of a value the clothing he wore had. Yet, even so, his only priority, the reason behind all of his actions, was for the happiness of those he held dear. Isn't that the most common of desires? Honestly, that should not have been the reaction of an undead, the mortal enemy of the living. He was too human. He could not understand the exact level of consideration the Sorcerer King had placed on this matter to have arrived at this conclusion, but from that bit of conversation, he could sympathize with him a little. Haha, yes, indeed. Just like a normal human. Zanak shifted his gaze from the minister to the exterior of the tent. If say, before things had turned out this way, perhaps he could have thought up a better method to deal with this. But, they were past the point of no return already. So what is the status of the command hierarchy and battle preparations? Your Highness subordinates those from the capital are ready to move out immediately. Distributing our men between the capital's residences proved to be effective. The speed of the landed nobles, however, leaves much to be desired. They are still debating on who should be vanguard. The Minister of Military Affairs ranted on without hiding his disdain. That cannot be helped. They are not under our command after all. Some of the nobles have not even made the resolve of self-sacrifice. We can only hope that they will not initiate the battle before the rest of us are ready. The lower our expectations are, the less disappointed we would be. It was indeed troubling if they could not even synchronize amongst their own ranks for this battle. That said, without their forces, they would lose out on a quarter of their mobilized soldiers. That scenario would be equally troublesome. Even if the Sorcerer King's magic was to only kill 200,000 like last time, assuming that half of their army and their corresponding nobles survive, just how much responsibility would fall onto a quarter of their current forces? So what is our current strategy? None whatsoever, Your Highness. The Minister of Military Affairs laughed in a tired and apathetic way. We do not have a formation in mind, we will just be blindly charging into them. Because of that, if we were to do nothing to prevent the soldiers from losing their morale, that would not be good. Shall I form an anti-retreat force? You shouldn't. Rather than that, the Royal Knights should be stationed at the front, and... Your Highness, do forgive me for speaking out of line, but let us be the vanguard. Zanak looked towards him with a gaze that said, are you sure? Putting his own condition aside, it was hard for him to imagine this skinny, jaundiced man swinging a sword around. If someone has to stand at the front, please do allow me to be that man. Your Highness should command from the rear. Zanak and the minister looked at each other for a while and he nodded his head. I am very glad that you could understand. The minister's gaze trailed towards the ceiling of the tent. There was neither anything of note there nor could he see the sky, yet he stared at it for a moment while he mumbled to himself. To be honest, I never liked that man Stranov, yet not a day passes where I did not wish that he could be here. I can sympathize with you. It's just that, I was quite fond of him. Just as the minister meekly smiled, a commotion could be heard outside. What's going on? Did the Source Rouse Kingdom make their move? No, Zanak raised his ear and laughed, not at all. A group of impassioned people stormed the tent. Landed nobles whose fiefdoms were around though a certain distance away from the capital. Among them were the nobles who had turned pale a while ago and what appeared to be mercenaries wielding blood-stained swords. What do you intend to do with your drawn swords in His Highness' tent? Fall back. None of the nobles answered the Minister of Military Affairs' roar. They all looked towards Zanak like cornered rats. Zanak wanted to hold his belly in a hearty laugh. He more or less felt it when he entered the camp, he completely understood what thoughts their stupidity had wrought. He had appointed the knights under him to commanding positions, so for them to have been swayed away from his side was a failure all on its own. This was a mutiny spurred on by his loss of agency, yet he did not expect them to have plotted against him especially under these circumstances. He could not have expected the rationality of humans to have stooped so low. No, that was inaccurate. Their actions in a sense, were correct. They were simply trying their darndest for a chance at survival. Zanak could only have himself to blame. He was not able to empathize with them, he was not able to quench their qualms, he was not able to unite them under the same banner. What would his father have done? Zanak almost ruined the serious face he had put on with his best efforts by laughing out loud. Fall back. You imbeciles. Please stop. Minister. But. Your Highness. I said stop. You should fall back. I cannot take that order. Minister. End of the line, Your Highness. There's no use buying time now. Humph. I was planning no such thing. Although he was wearing the armor that was a national treasure, Zanak was not well trained for combat. If it were his brother instead, this would have been a different story, but it was impossible for Zanak alone to slay every hostile here. If their treachery was not the spur of the moment but instead had been well planned from the start, he would have no chance at salvation at all. He focused his gaze on them and saw that they were terrified. How disgraceful! If they truly believed in themselves, they would have held their heads up high. That was why Zanak held his head up high, to convey his grit. So, what was so important that you must come to my tent to talk to me about? Do you not understand what it means to draw your swords here in my presence? Of course, Your Highness. This war, please forfeit it? Zanak smiled. It is a waste of time to surrender to His Majesty the Sorcerer King. I have received his message loud and clear, he will never accept our subservience, although you might not believe me, our only hope lies in His Majesty the Sorcerer King's defeat. There's no way we can win. One of the nobles mumbled and Zanak concurred. Even so, we have no option other than to fight. I suggested vassalage, but it was useless. I will reiterate, our only hope of survival is through battle. Perhaps that is the case for your highness, but, maybe if we were to contribute enough merit, they will let us live. Please sacrifice yourself so that we may live. The noblemen began joining in agreement. This whole thing began because of the people who stood in the way of the Sorcerer's kingdom's grain transport. We should not be held accountable for them. We will pledge our loyalty to the Sorcerer King. To Zanak, what they were saying was no different than what the noble women would say about their ideal night during tea parties. Still, he understood where they were coming from. Let me say one thing, it is useless for you to take me to him. I, as a member of the royalty, have made up my mind to battle to the end. Those of you who wish to die here, do try. Yaridas. Blue on blue, what an absolute joke. No, he should count himself fortunate that these fools would meet their ends right here. Surely they cannot burden his sister or father after this, right? Well, his sister would be safe from these idiots by virtue of that warrior by her side alone. Those who wish to claim my head, come if you dare. Zanak pulled his sword out and stood shoulder to shoulder with the minister. While he had no confidence in his swordsmanship, his armor will more than make up for it. Zanak stared at the noblemen, frozen in their tracks. What? Weren't you all out for blood? Shouldn't you have at least prepared to dirty your own hands even if you were to force poison down my throat? Aren't you supposed to have made your resolve? The nobles looked at each other. They had not even considered that. Fucking pathetic. Was his life really about to be terminated by incompetent bastards like them? At the end of the day, after having witnessed the military might of the Sorcerer King, it must have been fear that rendered them so short-sighted to be unable to see reason. He was not fit to rule after all. He did not have his father's virtue, his brother's charisma, or his sister's intellect. He had nothing at all, but that was fine. He did not want to be king anyways, he merely wanted this kingdom to be functional. That's right. To give unto this country, its people, and his family. To give unto them happiness. Then, one of the nobles called to people outside of the tent and multiple tough-looking mercenaries entered. Zanak swirled his tongue around and recalled the silhouette of his brother swinging a sword. He mimicked his brother's movements and charged at the nobleman. In their camp, Cocytus, Aura, and Mare were just discussing the upcoming siege of the capital when Albedo, who was supposed to be conducting the final inspection of the formations, came in with a troubled expression. What happened? Albedo responded to his questioning gaze. In Sama, it seems like there was some commotion in the enemy's camp. What? Commotion? What happened? In stood up and walked out of the tent. It did appear as though there was some sort of trouble there, or it was more accurate to say that a fight had broken out amongst themselves. In the end, a group of cavalry emerged from the enemy camp. It did not appear as though they were eager vanguards. As Ins watched them silently, the group swiftly reached the Sorcerer's kingdom's front. They were mercenaries equipped with all sorts of equipment, as well as a few noblemen. A man in his prime, who had the air of a noble around him, stepped forth from the group. That man began shouting almost hysterically, his voice was carried towards Ins by the wind. I have matters to discuss with His Majesty the Sorcerer King. Please. Zanak was not among them. The commotion in their camp plus the small amount of nobles in this group told Ins all he needed to know. Albedo, bring them over. He did not look towards the bowing Albedo, but instead returned to his tent where his body fell heavily upon the temporary throne. The three guardians stood silently beside Ins. After a short while, 10 noblemen were brought over by Albedo. The mercenaries who were serving as bodyguards had appeared to have been left behind. They were shocked by the sight of Ins upon his throne, more shocked by the sight of Cocytus by his side, and confused by Aura and Mare's presence. Do as you should in front of the one above all. The nobles of the kingdom took a knee near the entrance of the tent and lowered their heads towards Ins. Raise your heads. Albedo, who was now standing beside Ins, said, "A pleasure to make your acquaintance, your majesty." The eldest of the nobles began to speak. From the other's expressions, he appeared to be the leader of this posse. "We are in awe of your majesty's greatness and wish to serve under your reign. First of all, we have an offering for your majesty." One of the nobles took out a sack-like object from his back. Albedo was about to respond before Ins stopped her. He stood up slowly as he had practiced numerous times from his throne and moved to the noble's side. He was handed the sack. "Does not appear to be a trap, huh?" A disappointed Ins looked at the sack. The smell of blood gushed from within the sack. He could already guess what was inside. Ins opened it to take a look inside. His eyes met Zanak's. Ins observed it in detail. They had just met, so it was hard for him to tell if this was a body double or not. However, given how they were acting, it was unlikely for this to be the head of a body double. Ins closed the bag, walked back to his throne to hand the sack over to Albedo, and said, "Give him a proper burial." He had many other corpses he could use for the creation of the undead. Letting go of Zanak's was fine. "So, what happened to the armor he was wearing?" The nobles looked towards Ins with baffled expressions upon hearing Ins's question. They probably thought that the head of their general was more than enough for their prize. "What? Do you not have an answer to Insama's question?" "And no. Yes, that armor should still be on the prince's corpse in his tent." The noble who acted as their representative hurriedly answered Albedo's unemotive question. "Is that so? I see. You all. Good job." The nobles all responded with yes, as relief bloomed on their faces and as they lowered their heads. "I shall reward you appropriately for your accomplishment. So, what do you wish for?" "Please spare me and my family." "Your Majesty the Sorcerer King. I swear my absolute fealty to you." Suddenly, the noble behind the representative began yelling, prompting the annoyed representative to bark. "This guy? Me too. Your Majesty. Please extend the same mercy to me too." More and more "me too" s piled on. Ins waved his hands magnanimously to silence their pleas. "I understand. I understand. I completely understand you all. Everybody here wishes for the same thing, correct?" The noble began nodding their heads furiously. "Is that so? Well, I will not kill you then. Albedo, send them to Neuronist." "Understood. Your Majesty, what about our family?" Ins did not overlook one of the nobles attempting to whisper to him. "Your family too?" Ins smiled. Of course, they had no way of perceiving that. "What will I do about you all?" "Albedo, inquire where their families are and send them over too." "Yes, Insama." "You all, come over here." The nobles were led away from the tent by Albedo. After they were gone, Ins motioned for Aura to come forth and gave the following order. "Those who do not wish to die, do not grant it to them." "That is an order." "Yes, Insama." Ins caught Aura's hand as she was about to leave. He continued to the confused Aura. "Even if they desire death, do not grant it to them for now." "Understood." After he had let go of her hand and after she had confirmed that he had no other orders, Aura ran after Albedo. Ins's gaze remained fixated on her back as he gave his orders to the two remaining guardians. "I've lost interest. With Cocytus as commander and Mare as second in command, I permit the two of you to use the full extent of your abilities. Do not leave a single citizen of the kingdom unscathed." The two responded affirmative. An hour later the army that was the kingdom of Riestai's last hope disappeared completely from the face of this world.